Okay. Okay, so hopefully folks are able to see my screen. So as I mentioned, today our session is on exploring disability inclusion in newcomer services. The session will be approximately an hour and a half, so from 1 to 2:30. And before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. So I'd like to start by honoring the land that we are on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations, on which I recognize that I am an uninvited guest. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties and other agreements, including the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. We are mindful of broken covenants and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. I would also like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and so I honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. Thank you for allowing me to read this land acknowledgement. Okay, so as I mentioned, the session will be recorded. And at the bottom, you should also see a Q&A box. So where you can put your questions there. You're also free to put it in the chat if that is easier for you. Or at the end, unmute to ask your questions for our facilitator today. So I'd like to provide just a brief workshop overview before I pass it on to our facilitator, who will go into it with detail. So this session is a part of the Toronto Southwest Local Immigration Partnership's ongoing commitment to supporting the advancement of inclusion across the newcomer serving sector. We recognize that newcomers with disabilities often face layered and intersecting barriers when accessing services. And so we're hoping that this session will provide or will allow strengthening of our collective understanding of disability inclusion, and that it'll provide practical strategies and tangible tools to foster accessibility in your service delivery and organizations. Okay, so I'd like to now introduce our facilitator, and I will be reading her bio so folks can get to know her a little bit more before she leads us through this session. So Tina Doyle is a seasoned accessibility leader with more than 30 years of experience advancing disability inclusion across education, public, and nonprofit sectors. She brings a deep understanding of disability, grounded in both professional expertise and lived experience, and applies a user-centered, human rights-based approach to her work. Tina has extensive experience leading service delivery for post-secondary students with disabilities with intersecting identities, which informs her focus on improving client journeys and embedding accessibility into everyday interactions and organizational practices. A skilled educator and speaker, she has taught at the University of Toronto and co-developed province-wide training for accessibility professionals with Wilfrid Laurier University. She currently serves on Ontario's Accessibility Standard Advisory Council and previously chaired the AODA Post-Secondary Education Standards Development Committee. Through her company, AccessAdvance Consulting, Tina provides strategic advice, delivers training, conducts research and accessibility audits, and leads service reviews to help organizations create inclusive environments that go beyond compliance. Tina holds a Master of Science in Disability Services in Higher Education and is a registered social service worker. So with that, I would like to pass it on to Tina, and I'll let her take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can put up the slides. I will just add to my bio. I'm also a wife and mother. I have 2 adult children. Both have disabilities and are living with me, and my husband. So, and I've grown up as a person with disabilities from childhood and lived with people with disabilities my whole life. So this is it's just embedded in who I am in terms of social justice when it comes to people being excluded and marginalized because of their identity. So thank you so much. So you can go to the next slide. Okay. So just before I started, I wanted to do just an accessibility check and say a little bit about myself. I mentioned it, but I wanted to say that my pronouns are she and her. I'm a white middle-aged woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes wearing a black top. And I say that for people who have low vision and cannot see me. And so I will say, I will do this throughout the presentation because this is a way of showing you accessibility. I'm really happy to be here today. And so before we begin, I just wanted to highlight some of the accessibility features. So in Zoom, there is a closed captioning button. So at the bottom bar of the Zoom, you will see CC or show captions. So that's available. Hopefully you all received the materials in advance. When you do speak, I just want to remind you to say your name before you speak. And this helps participants who are blind or have low vision, or people joining by phone who can't see who's talking, and they get used to your voice. And then also it helps the captioning because it will identify the name of the person speaking in transcripts. You will also hear me throughout the presentation say the slide number as we go. And this helps participants with low vision follow along since they can't see when the slide changes. And it's just a small example of accessible design to support people with disabilities. And finally, when you, if you can make sure you're on mute when you're not speaking, because this helps sound quality and caption accuracy for those who have low vision. Hearing loss. Next slide. Okay, so on slide 3, this is the session roadmap. So in this session, we're going to look at accessibility through a service delivery lens. So what this means is why it matters. Well, it's what does this mean, why it matters, and how design choices shape people's experiences. So I'm going to briefly walk you through our time together. So we'll start with some key concepts and language and just look at common barriers across service touch points, explore models of inclusive service design, and then we will move into the breakout groups to explore these ideas with real cases. And then we'll close with practical commitments to action areas and areas for further learning. And my goal is to keep the session grounded and practical. I did want to highlight, though, I just want to acknowledge the work that all of you do every day in the newcomer-serving sector. You are already grounded in a very, say, person-centered, equity-focused approach. So your roles are built around supporting people navigating complex systems, transitions, and barriers. So inclusion is already part of your professional DNA. So in the current climate, though, I know when we're often asked to do more with less, it's even more important that practices are practical, realistic, and aligned with what you're already doing as much as possible. So what I'm hoping today is really you'll see this as expanding on practices that many of you are already using, listening deeply, adapting your services, meeting people where they are, and recognizing the whole person in front of you. Disability inclusion and accessibility build on the same foundations that guide the settlement sector. So dignity, respect, cultural humility, and equitable access. So many of the strategies we'll explore today will likely feel intuitive because they reinforce the approaches you're already using to support your clients. So I'll give you, though, additional language and some frameworks and practical tools in how you're looking at how you're delivering service. So I really hope this session is affirming what you're already doing and deepening your understanding. Next slide. So here on slide 4, I just want to take a moment, just like a few seconds. I just want to ask you to think of a time when you witnessed someone else being excluded in the workplace, school, or community setting. And I'm sure you all have had those experiences with your clients as well. So just reflect on what created the exclusion and the kinds of effects exclusion can have on someone who experienced exclusion. So many of us can usually remember even ourselves being left out or dismissed, and those moments stay with us. So this exercise is really about acknowledging that exclusion has an emotional weight. And this is what many of the clients, especially those with disabilities, experience regularly, not because of who they are, but because of how systems are designed and how they are treated in those systems. Next slide. And this slide on quote on slide 5 is from Kath Holmes, and I think it really captures the idea. And it says, ask 100 people what inclusion means, and you'll get 100 different answers. Now ask them what it means to be excluded, and the answer will uniformly is uniformly clear. It's when you're left out. So inclusion can be complicated, but exclusion is simple. Everyone knows what it feels like. So remembering our own experience helps us build empathy and makes more thoughtful, inclusive choices in our services, our programs, and our everyday interactions. Next slide. And so the Kath Holmes, that quote reminds us that inclusion can seem complicated, exclusion is not. And when we talk about disability, the conversation often comes it's more complex. There's no single definition of disability. I've put a definition from the dictionary on slide 6. The Human Rights Commission for Ontario has a different definition. But what you will often see is most definitions still focus on the deficit of the person. So describing them disability in terms of what a person lacks or cannot do. So these outdated views still shape why organizations design services and policies. And they're really part of why barriers still exist today. And this is why we need to shift our lens. So instead of asking what is wrong with the person, we need to ask what is wrong with our environment, our process, our interactions that is creating these barriers, and what can we do to change to support our clients with dignity, access, and full participation. Oh, you're seeing slide 7, I'm seeing. Oh, sorry, I don't know, it flipped over there. Can you go back to slide 7? Where it has all the, yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so sorry there. I will just say, if you, the slide 6 with the definition is really just talking about what one of the part of the definition is it prevents someone from engaging in gainful employment. Considering I have multiple disabilities and I've been gainfully employed for most of my life, that's clearly not true. So this list, so I'll go back to slide 7, if you could, sorry. The list of the synonyms and near synonyms for disability. So you see a list of words here, and it's really often how disability is described in everyday language. So many of the terms are negative. So you see the word deficiency, you see insufficient, and these terms come from old ways of thinking, but they still show up how society talks about disability. So really the question is, like, if these are the words we use and the belief underneath them, what does that do to people with disabilities? What assumptions does it create? And what expectations does it lower? And how might those assumptions show up in our services, our policies, and our interactions with people with disabilities? This is why shifting our mindset, it matters, because language shapes how people are treated and how included they feel. Next slide. So I can't, my eyes are a little off today, so I was having trouble seeing the number on the slides previously. So and thanks for putting that in the chat. So here on slide 8, you'll see the antonyms for disability, and it's words like ability, capability, and competence. So when the dictionary positions these as the opposite of disability, it reinforces sits on the other side of strengths and talent. And there's a speaker named Amy Mullins, and she highlighted this in her talk she did years ago. And every time I hear her, I always feel a little emotional, even though I've seen it multiple times. I'm reminding how painful and limiting these definitions of disability are for people with disabilities. And since I live with it, most of my family have disabilities, it really kind of it hits home. So you can, next slide. So as we look at slide 9, I've included the definition of internalized ableism. And this is when a person with a disability starts to believe those words that describe disability. And this is how words and attitudes shape a person's identity and their potential. And one of the things Amy Mullins did say is it's not just the words themselves, it's what we believe about people when we name them those things. And our language shapes our thinking, our values, and how we see human potential. So for some people with disabilities, unfortunately, those negative labels are internalized. So they start to believe them. They start to believe they're not capable, and they see they're sometimes treated through that lens, and it affects confidence, not competence. It affects confidence, opportunity, and how they see themselves. And we also know many people with disabilities who refuse to be defined by those words, but others carry the weight of a lifetime of low expectations. And the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, the late David Onley, said, for many people with disabilities, the world is still filled with barriers that still wear you down. And when someone internalizes the stigma about disability, it affects everything, including whether or not they feel safe to disclose. Even with people who do the type of work you do, they may not disclose. They may not ask for accommodations because they feel like they're an inconvenience. So understanding this can help how you respond to your clients. And this is why, language matters. And you may have heard some people, how they describe themselves as a person with a disability. So you may hear person first or identity first language. So person first means, you'll hear it. You'll say the person is named before the disability. So a person with a disability. In identity first, it places the identity up front, like autistic person or a deaf person. That's with a capital D. That's people who are identify as being culturally deaf and use sign language. So many people choose this because it reflects pride and community. So there is a one right approach. So I just want to, when you're thinking about language, the most respectful thing to do is listen to the person you're working with to learn how they're referring to themselves. For many people with disabilities, they choose their own language and that's how they reclaim their identity, rather than the narrow definitions that you see. That I just mentioned. So next slide is slide 10. So it's just I just wanted to do that reflection because it helps us remember why accessibility legislation exists in the first place. So the law defines our obligations, but its purpose is deeper. It's really to remove barriers, affirm rights, and prevent the kind of exclusion we just reflected on. So when we look at the legislative context, I want to invite you to consider not just what the law means, so like what it requires, but what it intends. Next slide. So in slide 11, this highlights the Ontario Human Rights Code. I'll refer to it as the code, and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is the AODA. These are laws that actually work together to promote equality and accessibility in Ontario. The code is barrier removal upon request, like that's what we call accommodation. And it really requires organizations to remove barriers when a person identifies a need, or if it's recognized, by a service provider that that's what they need. They know, we need to make sure our space is accessible for them to get in, for example. But it's very individualized. So that's what we call accommodation. And it applies in all areas of service. At the same time, the code also requires organizations to remove systemic barriers, so not just respond to one person at a time. So that's where the AODA works together with the code, because the AODA focuses on barrier prevention. So it requires organizations to really think about in advance, identify barriers, remove them, and prevent them, to take action so that people with disabilities can fully use those services. The code, the Ontario Human Rights Code, is actually a higher law than the AODA. It overrides the AODA and other legislation. So what that means is, like, for example, if a person with a disability asks you for an accommodation, say requesting that the document they have is made in an accessible format, you can't say, well, the AODA law doesn't require us to make that accessible until 2026, which is how, the standards say roll out. So you have the person in front of you and they need something right now. And that's where the code kind of kicks in there. So even though there's legislation, compliance alone doesn't guarantee inclusion. And that's where a person-centered or human-centered approach takes us beyond the letter of the law. And that really focuses on, like, the experience of the individual. And instead of asking, did we meet the requirement, really what we want to ask is, did this person feel welcome? Did they feel included? Did they feel respected? Were they able to participate? And so the law sets the floor, but person-centered practice is what raised the ceiling. So in other words, the AODA tells us what we must do, but the person-centered approach really helps us think about how we do it and why we do it. So you really are thinking about it not just from compliance, but from the intent, the lens of intent. Next slide. So as we move into slide 12, we really shift from that legal framework to what people are actually experiencing when they try to access services. So even though we have strong laws, and the intent is clear, many people with disabilities still face barriers in their everyday interactions with organizations. So when I talk about barrier, the AODA legislation defines this really as preventing, it's something that prevents a person with a disability from fully participating in all aspects of society because of their disability, including a physical, architectural, information communication, attitudinal, technological, a policy, or a practice. So that's a barrier, covers really everything. So many people face barriers when trying to access service. There's sometimes inaccessible buildings, and the space makes it hard to enter. There's a lack of alternative communication formats, which we'll talk about more. And staff may not have enough disability awareness. So thank you for coming today. Digital tools and websites and flyers and information that are on websites may not be usable by everybody. And policies sometimes don't think about accessibility needs when we talk about policies. So sometimes there's like rigid schedules, rigid rules. And sometimes we need to step outside the rigidity and think about the person and how this maybe is this rule excluding this person. So that's what I'm really thinking about as we move forward. So there's a list of examples I've given. I'm not going to read every one of them. I've kind of talked through them, but they're available for you. Next slide. So this is slide 13. I just really wanted to talk through some of the model of the way you can think about how you're designing what you do and how you're delivering service. Next slide. So in slide 14, this model, it really helps us think differently about how we design and deliver service. So most things are designed for 80% of the users. And so there's a picture on this slide with it's kind of like a starburst. They call it the starburst. And in the center, you see a lot of dots. And that's kind of like 80% of the people. And that's usually how design works. So thinking about the 80%, because that's the majority. And that's typically the pattern. But the further you get out, you're leaving 20% out. And those are the people on the margins. And they're struggling with barriers that were never even considered for the majority. So, I'm sure you can appreciate this, as many of your clients, like they're learning English, they're settling into a new country, they don't know the culture necessarily. So, they're often really in the 20% as well. So really this model challenges to flip that approach of not thinking about the 80% of how we're designing, but thinking about the 20. And if we can improve, if we can think about the 20 from the start, it can actually improve the experience for everyone. It fuels innovation in that 20%. It strengthens accessibility, it leads to more inclusive, flexible, and usable services for everybody. So in short, if we can design for those who can't use the current system or find it difficult to use, we can create a better system for everybody. Next slide. So we'll now move to kind of, these are move to frameworks for everyday service context, such as booking appointments and those sort of steps in the journey. Next step. So on slide 16, really the focus on here is really, it's simple. It's about inclusive service design starts by planning for the people at the margins. And when we design for every touch point to be accessible, from information seeking when they're thinking about your service, are they able to use the service? Are they eligible for the service? All the way to when they're exiting the service. Are we thinking about each step? And if you do, it can help reduce the barriers before they even arrive. And one of the things, another quote from Kat Holmes is the quote I had earlier, is that it can remind us that people who design the touch points of society determine who can participate and who's left out. So if you think about your own touch points in your service, like what forms you're using, phone calls, online intakes, reception, and thinking about, are they usable for everybody? And we'll have examples of how some of them might not be. It can help you improve accessibility. And like I said, there's really a newcomer's journey. They're going to likely encounter, if they have a disability, depending on the disability, they may encounter barriers along each of those steps and not tell you, because they are embarrassed, there's shame, they don't want to, like I said, be an inconvenience. They don't want to look like they are difficult, because that's often how people with disabilities are portrayed when they ask for things they need, that they're difficult. So even though they trust you, say if you have a trusting relationship with them, there's often a major fear of disclosure. Once they get to know you, maybe they'll, often I would see a lot of people disclose, but initially it's sometimes hard for them too. Okay, so next slide. So what I want to do is, this is slide 17. We're going to shift from thinking about the touch points into like actually applying it in practice, those touch points. So what I'm going to do is we're going to move you into breakout groups. open up your cases if you all received them. If you didn't, hopefully there's someone else in the group so you can work through the cases together. What I want you to do is choice is a good thing. Yes. Yeah. If the report isn't there, sometimes it is helpful to switch. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight just the highlights of understanding accessibility means more. Oh, sorry, there. 19. Yeah, okay. It means more than just removing barriers to communication. It's really, if we grasp what accessibility means, it's about meeting the diverse needs of people so they feel welcome and applying some of the things I talked about, the disability frameworks, and thinking about like just being intentional and grounded in real experience. Legislative compliance, like I said, it's the minimum standard, but you know, that is like key of knowing you need to meet the minimum, but strive for more. And because striving for more is the intent and the spirit of the law. And finally, continuous improvement. So staying curious, checking our assumptions, learning directly from people with disabilities can make your service stronger. Next slide, slide 20. And what I've done is identified some 6 commitments that can strengthen accessibility across your service that we've talked about. You know, streamline your client journey and ask yourself, is this how many steps are here? And do we need them to do this or not? And you know, communicate in multiple ways. Make sure there's options for people to communicate with you, not just one way. Allow clear practices for support persons so that when a support person comes in, they're able to also come into a meeting if there's a support person and talk to the person with a disability, not the support person. That was one of the scenarios. But make sure that the staff know the rules around that. Think about physical accessibility and you know, co-design with people with disabilities. And really just understand accessibility is a shared responsibility. So it's not just the job of one person, it's really the whole organization and everybody in it. And then the last slide, this is where it's just a list of things that you might want to benefit from deeper training. Like, you know, you want to build your confidence in designing accessible documents. There's a lot of steps, but it's actually quite easy once you start doing it. You want to think about writing accessibility, your policies with accessibility and human rights in mind. So, and strengthening if you have accommodation policies. So thinking about that. You can also get training on accessible event planning. So these training areas, I just wanted to highlight that it can help organizations move from individual and accommodation to more proactive. And it's 2:30 now. So I just wanted to say, just wanted to focus on this slide 22. It's not about fixing the person, it's about fixing the systems. So I thank you so much for those of you who interacted. Glad there was a bit of a backup. And I hopefully you got what you need out of this session. And I'd listed those training. Those are things that I do, or I work with someone, especially around accessible documents. So if you need anything, please feel free to reach out to me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.